This is going to be a lecture on the eastern half of the Roman Empire over the course of the early Middle Ages, or what are sometimes also called the late Antique period. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire is commonly called the Byzantine Empire by modern Western scholars. That's because the original city that had been on the location that Constantine refounded as the city of Constantinople had been called Byzantium. That was an old Greek city-state. It wasn't particularly important during the older period of ancient classical and Hellenistic Greece, or even during the Roman Empire. But Constantine, of course, as we saw, refounded it as an enormous new Christian capital, a new Rome for the Roman Empire. Now, as I've mentioned several times, the Byzantines did not call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans, or actually they called themselves Romanoi, because they now spoke Greek, as I've mentioned before. That was increasingly the language of the Roman Empire, of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, starting around in the 500s and really solidified by the time we reach the end of this lecture in the 800s. It had slowly replaced Latin as the language of government in the East. Latin had never really come to dominate in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and what we have seen were previously the Hellenistic kingdoms. In terms of everyday speech or literature, Greek had become the common language and remained that way even during the high point of the Roman Empire. The term Byzantine, in fact, shows a great deal of Western prejudice. And it's a term that was chosen by early modern scholars after the entire period that we'll be covering in this class. Because for centuries, as far as Western scholars were concerned, and in fact in the way many Westerners even think today, this civilization, this Byzantine civilization, was not Rome. We've already seen that this is a misnomer of the fall of the Roman Empire, which of course only refers to the western half of the Roman Empire. As we'll see, the eastern half will continue for centuries, for nearly 1,000 years. Moreover, the fact that the very word Byzantine has also come to be an adjective meaning devious and convoluted shows that most Westerners think of this civilization that managed to outlast the Western Empire by almost a millennium in very negative terms. And that's terribly unfair because the West owes a great deal to Byzantium, to the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. And that's not just in the way that most Westerners, if they know anything about the Byzantines, are willing to concede something to them. And that's usually that the Byzantines kept Muslims out of Europe. That sort of attitude really shows more about the West's prejudice towards Islam than it does any positivity towards the Byzantines. No, Western Europe owes a great deal to the survival of classical literature to the Byzantines. Now, it's become relatively common knowledge today that the Islamic world preserved much of Greek philosophy that the West failed to remember because they didn't know and therefore didn't bother to copy Greek texts. And we'll discuss this in more depth in a few weeks when we talk about learning in the Middle Ages in universities and madrasas. But the Muslim world was rather selective in what they preserved of the classical Greek heritage. Muslims had little interest in preserving Greek pagan literature, the plays, the poetries, and the histories. They were almost entirely concerned with what we would think of as science and philosophy. And that means that the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, Sappho's poetry, the histories of Herodotus, the classical Athenian theater plays of Aeschylus and Euripides, these all survive because they were carefully preserved by literate, educated Greek speakers in the Eastern Roman capital of Constantinople. Human civilization would be infinitely poorer without these survivals. And of course, the Byzantines provided their own new contributions to the arts as well, and we will see a few of these in this lecture. But the Byzantines did not survive to become a modern state. In fact, their end as a political institution with the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks will mark one of the final moments of this course, and is in many ways a massive break between the medieval and the modern world. Because they didn't have advocates when the first modern histories were being written down in the 18th and 19th century, since that history was almost entirely focused on the histories of what had become modern nations, the Byzantines are all too often passed over. They deserve at least one lecture all to themselves, and we shall have cause to refer to them repeatedly right down to the end of this course. What I'm going to do in this lecture, though, is give a narrative arc that takes the Byzantines from one of their greatest heights under Justinian, whom I have already mentioned in our lecture on barbarian kingdoms as the aggressor in the Gothic War with the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, and I'm going to take them down to a very low moment after their near collapse in the face of the Arab conquests at the beginning of Islam that we'll be talking about next week. And then we're going to take them back up to, if not their former glory, at least a newfound stability, where we can leave them until we pick up their story again on the eve of the Crusades. And just a small spoiler, there are no Crusades without the Byzantines. They are an absolutely essential component in understanding why the Crusades happened and how they were carried out. All right, well, with that background in mind, let us get started and begin on a high note. The reign of the Emperor Justinian, who officially reigned solo from 527 to 565, although he had been effectively co-emperor with his uncle from as early as 518, meaning that he was in charge of the empire for nearly half a century, is often seen as a golden age of the early Byzantine Empire. As we saw with other long-reigning emperors, particularly Augustus, this is the kind of thing that lets a ruler really put their stamp on a society, and few have done that more than Justinian. Justinian's background was a bit unusual and presented him with both difficulties and opportunities. His family were originally poor provincial peasants from the regions between Greece and Italy, that is, the Balkans. His native language was Latin, making him perhaps the last native Latin-speaking emperor in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And that's another way in which Justinian presents a transition from the ancient world into the early medieval world. Justinian's uncle had risen up through the ranks to command the palace guards. That was really in keeping what we've already seen with the emperors of the era of the late Roman Empire of the Dominate. It should remind us of the earlier emperor Diocletian that we looked at, who ended the 3rd century crisis. Now, Justinian's uncle had adopted Justinian and given him a top-notch education. Justinian's uncle managed to finagle his way onto the throne when the previous emperor had died childless, and Justinian helped him rule from day one. By the time his uncle died, therefore, Justinian was already a seasoned ruler. Justinian had the education and the smarts to rule, but of course his poor background made him unpopular with the elites in Constantinople. Again, that's very much in keeping with what we saw was the trend in the late era of the Roman Empire under the Dominate, where soldier emperors distanced themselves from the aristocracy in the Senate. And of course, Justinian ended up returning this favor right back at the aristocrats. Justinian was always willing to promote talent over aristocratic birth, and moreover, he was always willing to tax the nobles aggressively to get the money he needed for his many projects. Now, the best example of this preference for talent was his brilliant wife, Theodora. Theodora was 20 years Justinian's junior and a former prostitute by all accounts. But Justinian didn't just marry her out of lust. After all, he was the emperor. He could have had her on the side. No, he wanted a partner, and Theodora was as brilliant as Justinian, and she provided him with wise counsel until her early death before his own. They were an absolute scandal to the aristocracy, but even their most vicious detractors admitted that Justinian and Theodora were tireless workers and a good team. Now, a good example of both Theodora's skills and the hatred of the aristocracy for the couple is the famous Nike revolt in 532, when a chariot race turned into a riot that nearly brought down the government of Justinian. Now, sports have always been political, and that's because they are big public gatherings. Therefore, they have an enormous audience. In an empire without voting, these athletic competitions were the primary venue where citizens could express themselves in front of their political leaders. In Rome, long before this time, and later on in Constantinople, as we're seeing here, the audience at sporting events was used to routinely shouting demands to their emperor. That could be anything from lower taxes to their views on a current theological controversy. I know that sounds very strange to us in the modern world, but we do know that riots broke out in Constantinople over such things as whether or not, for instance, Mary was really the mother of God, and so on and so forth. But in this particular instance, in the Nike revolts of 532, there were a bunch of senators who had been angered by Justinian's policies towards the aristocracy. They may have either started a riot at a chariot race, or they took advantage of the murder and mayhem that ensued to try and overthrow Justinian and Theodora. Now, the name of the riot comes from the chant of the crowd, Nike, because that's the Greek word for victory. Of course, now, because of the modern shoe brand, we pronounce it Nike. Justinian was all set to flee the city. You have to keep in mind, actually, that the imperial palace in Constantinople, just as the old imperial palace in Rome, was directly adjacent and, in fact, had entrances directly onto the hippodrome, that is, the chariot racetrack. So Justinian was in a rough spot when this riot started. But Theodora told him to stand firm and not run away. She has a great quote, something along the lines of, "Purple makes as good a winding sheet," that is, better to die as an emperor wearing the color purple. Together they hatched a plan, and they managed to subdue the rioters and execute the rebellious senators, after which Justinian had a much more peaceful reign, at least internally. Justinian had numerous other accomplishments, of which I can only have time to give you two. First, Justinian created an enormous digest, that is, an edited collection of all Roman law going back centuries. When Roman law was rediscovered later in the West, in Western Europe in the High Middle Ages, as we will be talking about in our lecture on education, it was through a copy of this digest. And that it means that this digest is the major way that earlier Roman law from the ancient world, the Roman laws that the Rome that we have looked at so far, was ultimately preserved and channeled to the modern world. This digest, made by Justinian, collected laws that went all the way back to the period of the Republic. But Justinian also added his own laws, and of course, in the process of choosing what laws to keep and in what order to preserve them in, systematized the accumulated centuries of Roman law, which is no mean accomplishment in and of itself. Justinian's legal codes are therefore the basis of modern European and indeed international law. Justinian also built the most iconic structure in Constantinople and indeed in all of East Roman Byzantine history, Hagia Sophia, the cathedral of the city of Constantinople, literally meaning sacred wisdom. It has often been called a wonder of the world, and you can see it pictured here in the slide. It has a nested series of domes resting upon partial domes that was revolutionary in scope when it was first built, and set the standard for all subsequent Byzantine and indeed Eastern Orthodox Church architecture to come, and eventually became the model for the domed Islamic mosque. Having seen Hagia Sophia, I can tell you that it is astoundingly beautiful. The dome appears to float upon the light streaming in from dozens of windows, all reflected by what are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of gold mosaic tiles across the entire church. Now, Justinian also patronized the arts in a variety of other places in his empire, including in Ravenna in northern Italy. We'll see why he has control there in a moment. But this is one of the best places to still go see Byzantine mosaic artwork from this time period. And in fact, this small church in the north of Italy happens to be the location that the mosaics I've already shown you depicting Justinian and Theodora come from, and in fact were made during the lifetime of Justinian and Theodora, or perhaps shortly thereafter, and therefore give us a sense of what these two individuals actually looked like from their own lifetime. And it is also an absolutely beautiful, if much smaller church than Hagia Sophia. Now, unfortunately, Justinian also had numerous failures, namely his attempts to restore unity both to the church and to the Roman Empire. And in these respects also, Justinian aimed big, and if he failed, it was in part because he may have aimed too high. Now, let's first talk about the church. I've already mentioned on several occasions how the church was always in danger of splitting apart, and that there were always disagreeing views within the church. Now, sometimes these would split off into all-out heresies, but as I also mentioned in our lecture on the history of the church in this time period, there was also a slow evolution, a cultural change that was splitting the church into an Eastern Greek-speaking and a Western Latin-speaking halves. Not that they had any particular theological difference, but that they were becoming culturally distinct, what will eventually become the Western churches like the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern churches like the Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox churches. Now, Justinian recognized that there were problems. There were continuing arguments over heresy in his own day. Justinian was a gifted theologian among his numerous other talents, and he was determined to solve the many conflicting arguments about religious belief within mainstream Christianity. He was trying to heal recent divisions and prevent further ones. But what Justinian fundamentally failed to realize was that by the 500s, these divisions were no longer just about theology, but also about political divisions between the patriarchs, such as the Pope in Rome, or the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the Patriarch of Alexandria. They were fighting over prestige and also over increasingly cultural differences between the areas that they spiritually governed. There were theological differences as well, but these often stood in for wider issues that Justinian was not fundamentally able to address. And no amount of clever theology could solve these divisions. But they had started to cause major discontent within the empire, with implications that we'll see several generations after Justinian's death. Still, he attempted to solve these problems, but in the process may actually have driven the wedges deeper in the growing breakup of the Christian church. While we shall see that this growing religious disunity in the Eastern Empire had long-term political consequences, of more immediate concern was Justinian's failure militarily. Now, Justinian did not fail militarily immediately. In fact, at the beginning of his career, and for more than a decade, he was probably one of the most successful military conquerors in Roman history. Justinian had inherited an enormous budget surplus from his uncle, which gave him options, although he eventually managed to spend all of it. There's no faster way than to spend a government's money than by going to war. Justinian's background as a Latin speaker from the border between the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire encouraged him to want to reunify that old empire. And that's really something to keep in mind here, that we often think of Justinian's reign as after the inevitable end of the Western Roman Empire and the breakup of the Roman Empire into Eastern and Western halves, but Justinian did not see it that way. In the 500s, there were still many people who clearly thought that the Roman Empire of the High Imperial period, going all the way back to Augustus, could still be reconstituted. And that's exactly what Justinian set out to do. Now, it also had the additional added bonus that most of the aristocracy in Constantinople had been making war against the Persians of the Sassanid dynasty in the east, and so, therefore, turning the empire's attention to the west was a good way of sticking it to these aristocrats and making sure that they didn't get their way. So Justinian paid off the Persian Shah to make peace, and he set his sights on the west. Now, Africa was conquered relatively quickly as the Vandal kingdom collapsed. But even there, it proved much easier to conquer than to restore imperial administration. While the Vandal kingdom fell apart and quickly Justinian's bureaucrats spread into the area, it turns out that actually North Africa had suffered a real degradation of imperial infrastructure in the period under Vandal rule. And at the same time, while the Vandals were defeated as a united political entity, Justinian immediately had to start dealing with guerrilla uprisings of the local population. But this was not immediately obvious right after the conquest of the Vandal kingdom in 535. And so Justinian was ready to move on. He saw this as one easy conquest and thought that Italy would fall just as easily. But of course, as we've already seen in our lecture on barbarian kingdoms, the 20-year Gothic War in Italy, which Justinian initiated in 535, did end up destroying the Ostrogothic kingdom, but it devastated the urban infrastructure of the peninsula in the process. It spread a horrific outbreak of plague that eventually made its way all the way back to Constantinople and caused massive casualties across the Eastern Empire. It's easy to want to love Justinian and see him as an innovator, which in some ways he was. But he was also trapped in the past and still yearned to return to the world of the old unified Roman Empire, which increasingly was more and more impossible. Justinian certainly did not think he was medieval. He thought he was Roman, but he represents an important turning point from the ancient world into the medieval because of this. By the time Justinian died in 565, he had changed the course of the empire, but he had left it on very shaky footing, with a devastated army reeling from the Gothic War, facing foes from three directions. The first of these foes was simply the result of the chaos Justinian had caused in Italy. These were new barbarians called the Lombards, moving in, and they undid much of his conquest shortly after his death in the 560s. The Byzantines were not entirely ejected from Italy, but they barely held on to their toehold in the toe of the peninsula, sorry for the pun, and in Ravenna, the old capital of Theodoric, where our mosaics of Justinian and Theodora survive. But most of the rest of the peninsula was lost to the Byzantines, and they certainly were not recouping the losses of revenue that they were hoping to do so under Justinian. Justinian's hope had been by reconquering Italy, it would immediately start producing enormous revenues for the emperors, but of course it had been a financial boondoggle and money pit instead. Now, that was actually probably the least problematic of the opponents facing the Byzantines in the aftermath of Justinian's death, because at least Italy was to some degree peripheral, even if it had been an enormous financial sinkhole. A much bigger threat, although not the biggest, was an entirely new group of so-called barbarians beginning to invade across the Danube River into the remaining western territories of the Byzantines, the Balkans. And this group is called, are the Slavs of various different types. Now, here Byzantine failures were not quite so dismal, but neither were their successes total. The Slavic invaders eventually converted to Greek Eastern Christianity, or Orthodox Christianity, and that made them much more amenable to the diplomacy and even rule of the Byzantine emperors, at least in the long run. But this rule was never total, and these Slavic groups ended up setting up their own rival kingdoms, like those of Serbia and Bulgaria, and they remained a thorn in the side of the Byzantines down to the end of their empire. Now, sometimes these South Slavic kingdoms were subservient to the Byzantines, could be allies, might even be officially incorporated into the Byzantine Empire for a time, but at other times, the Slavs or the Bulgarians would form dangerous rivals to the Byzantine emperors. So, not a total loss, but not necessarily a great thing for the Byzantines either. But by far the most dangerous rivals were in the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire. Now, you'll remember that this was a new powerful dynasty. Well, it was new several centuries ago, my apologies. These Sassanid Shahs of Persia were seeking to revive the old Achaemenid Empire of Persia, back in the time of Cyrus and Darius 1,000 years earlier. These Sassanids, remember, had taken control of Persia and had caused such trouble for Rome at the beginning of the 3rd century and had been a major reason for that 3rd century crisis we talked about before the break. Justinian had paid the Sassanids off so that he could focus on reconquering Africa, North Africa and Italy, but that peace was only temporary. And in 602, taking advantage of a civil war that saw the end of Justinian's dynasty in the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Shah overran most of the Eastern Empire, taking the Levant, Egypt, and a good portion of Asia Minor Anatolia. It was an unparalleled disaster in Roman, much less in recent Byzantine history. And truth be told, that probably should have been the end of the Eastern Byzantine Empire. But they were once again saved by the strategic location and massive fortifications of their capital city of Constantinople, that new Rome built by Constantine, which the Persians could not conquer. And a brilliant emperor named Heraclius came to power, who reorganized the shattered Byzantine army, borrowed forcibly the wealth of the church, and took a daring approach. Rather than attempt to reconquer the territories that the Sassanid Persians had just taken, he counter-invaded the Persian Empire itself, and in a battle deep inside Mesopotamia, defeated the Sassanid Shah and forced him to withdraw from the lands he had conquered. In this respect, Heraclius is clearly emulating the victories of Scipio Africanus against Hannibal in the Second Punic War from hundreds of years earlier in Roman history. And of course, as a well-educated person thinking of themselves as a Roman, Heraclius would have been familiar with Scipio Africanus' strategies. But by this point, it was 626, and both the Persians and the Byzantines had been at war with each other for almost a quarter of a century. Remember, the Sassanids had invaded the Byzantine Empire way back in 602, so this was more than 20 years of war. That is, it's longer than the amount of time that the United States has been at war in Afghanistan, as of the time of this lecture, nearly 20 years. And that's the longest war in American history. At the same time, there was massive discontent within the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire, in places like Egypt and the Levant, places that had been conquered by the Persians, the Sassanid Persians, and had now been recovered by Heraclius. And the reason was that these areas tended to be ones where there were major differences of opinion over the Orthodox creed, and had actually, in some cases, these local Christians, who were increasingly thought of as heretics by the Byzantine emperor and the mainstream church, had actually welcomed Persian rule, because the Sassanid Shahs had widely let them practice their form of Christianity in peace, unlike the Byzantine emperors, who demanded uniformity of Christian worship and branded those who would not comply as heretics, a policy that we saw going all the way back to the first Christian emperor, Constantine, with the Council of Nicaea and the expulsion of the Arians. Heraclius, like Justinian before him, attempted to find a compromise creed, but was no more successful than his predecessor, and in fact, again, only exacerbated differences. So there were still, in other words, even though these territories had been reconquered from the Persians, enormous discontent in large sections of the eastern parts of the Byzantine Empire. And unfortunately for Heraclius, there was yet another potential rival willing to take advantage of these differences. It was exactly at this moment that the Arabs, newly united under the faith of Islam by the Prophet Muhammad, as we shall see in our next lecture, invaded both of these exhausted empires starting in 633, the year after Muhammad's death. Again, we'll cover Muhammad and the birth of Islam and the Arab world over the next two lectures, but here is the Byzantine perspective of it. I cannot stress this enough. The Arab conquest was utterly and totally unexpected. It was a thunderbolt from a clear blue sky. Recall how I mentioned several lectures ago, during the 3rd century crisis, how even the Roman Emperor Philip the Arab had dismissed other Arabs as not a serious threat. For centuries that had been true. Arabs were nothing but nomads living in Arabia, as far as many were concerned. There were some cities. They might be useful to hire as mercenaries or to fight proxy wars with the Persians, but they were considered no existential threat on the scale of the Persians or even the Germanic barbarians like the Goths. However, now the Arabs were united under a dynamic new religion of Islam, and the Arabs brought down the 400-year-old Sassanid Empire entirely in just 20 years, exhausted as it was by a quarter century of war with the Byzantines. And the Arabs nearly did the same thing for the Byzantines, capturing Syria, the Levant, and Egypt in just 10 years. These are the exact same areas that had recently been recaptured from the Sassanid Persians by Heraclius. By the 660s, Muslim Arab armies were besieging Constantinople itself, and they were defeated only by the invention of a mysterious substance that we now call Greek fire, something similar to napalm that gave Byzantines an enormous naval advantage, but which is poorly understood by modern historians. But poor Heraclius watched everything he had reconquered from the Sassanids lost again. Heraclius should have been remembered for all time as one of the greatest and most successful Roman emperors in history. And if he had died, In the moment of his victory over the Persians, perhaps he might have been. But still, that was not to be. Heraclius died a broken man, having seen all of his works undone. Now eventually, with the change of dynasties, the Arabs tired of attacking the Byzantines, and the border stabilized roughly around the mountains separating Asia Minor, Anatolia, from the rest of the Middle East. But the Byzantines were utterly devastated and demoralized. They had lost most of their empire in the east to the Arabs, and to the west to the Slavs and other barbarians. So here is a map showing the empire, this sort of early phase of the Byzantine Empire at its peak, around 550 CE. That is the time period that we saw Justinian had managed to conquer North Africa and Italy before losing them again. Here we are in 717 CE, less than 200 years later, and the Byzantine Empire has been dramatically reduced. On the European side, it largely only holds small territories by the coast in Italy, around Ravenna, and in the islands, a few of the islands and territories in Greece, the immediate area around Constantinople itself, and then much of Anatolia, having lost Egypt, North Africa, the Levant, Cyprus, and most of its territory in Italy, the Balkans, and what we would today call Greece. It was an enormous and devastating loss to the Byzantine East Roman Empire. These devastating losses created a crisis of confidence for the Byzantines that found its expression in a theological debate that turned into a civil war. We call this the iconoclastic controversy, and it raged off and on from the 720s to the 840s. Now, what is an icon, you might ask? An icon, in this context, is a religious painting of a holy figure, often Jesus or Mary, but also the saints. They had become increasingly popular in Eastern Greek Christianity, coming to almost reach the status of relics in their own right. And indeed, some of these icons were relics, like an icon that was supposed to have been painted by the evangelist Luke of Mary and Jesus and was paraded on the walls to ward off Arab attacks of Constantinople. In fact, here's an illustration of that painting in Constantinople. Icons are really a good example of the kind of cultural changes that were happening between the Latin Western Church and the Eastern Greek-speaking Church. Icons were extremely popular in the Greek-speaking East, but did not catch on nearly as much in the Latin-speaking West. This level of devotion to icons was really difficult for many Western Christians to understand. Now, it used to be thought that the rise of iconoclasm, and iconoclasm literally means the breaking of icons, came from Byzantines adopting the Muslim prohibition against depicting humans or animals in art. That used to be what scholars would always say about iconoclasm, that the Byzantines somehow looked at Muslim practices, saw that they didn't have any pictures of people or animals, and said, oh, well, we should be doing that too, that's why they're winning. However, modern scholars have looked at this much more closely. Recent scholarship has looked at this much more closely and has argued that there's really no evidence from the texts the Byzantines are producing themselves at the time that they're looking at Islamic Muslim culture at all for this precedent. And indeed, they didn't need to. The precedent already existed within Jewish and therefore, to some degree, within the Christian faith, because within the Torah, that is the first books of the Hebrew Bible, there is, of course, that prohibition in the Ten Commandments that thou shalt not make a graven image. This had been, of course, a part of Jewish religion for more than a millennium, and that had been adopted or co-opted by Christians when they decided to keep the Hebrew Bible as their so-called Old Testament. Now, of course, what constitutes a graven image has changed dramatically over time and depended on the different cultures involved. Most Jews and Christians have come to believe that not every image of a person or animal is by necessity a graven image, that is, a threat to the worship of the one God. Whereas in Islamic culture, it is much more common to not depict humans or animals, although there are still there still are areas of the Muslim world that have very little problem depicting most humans and animals at all. However, In the Byzantine Empire, in this approximately 120-year-long period, there was a major bout of iconoclasm, an idea that there should be no images of humans or animals, and in particular, none of these icons, images of holy people that were particularly revered like relics. This, however, is now seen by modern scholars as not simply a religious conflict. The Byzantines were searching for the cause of why these political military disasters had befallen them, and a dynasty of emperors who managed to, if not defeat the Muslims entirely, managed to at least stop the invasion and Muslim conquests, had declared that their victories came from rejecting all icons as graven images. Now, this position was strongly contested in Byzantine society. Many Byzantines strongly supported icons, and this led to persecutions and increasingly to extremism, as eventually iconoclasts even attacked monks as sort of living icons, and it didn't help that monks themselves were almost always on the side of using icons. They were very pro-icon. The whole iconoclastic controversy, however, which eventually erupts into what is effectively a civil war, was motivated by a number of other causes as well. Competing political factions at the court in Constantinople would often back the side, either icon or iconoclastic, based on which side their enemy had chosen. And the two positions also roughly reflected an urban-rural split in the empire, as iconoclasts tended to come from the poorer rural provinces, away from Constantinople, that couldn't afford expensive icons covered in gold and jewels. And that, of course, is also the region that these new tough soldier emperors who had managed to halt the Muslim invasions came from as well. Now, in the end, the iconoclastic position lost, and icons were restored. Indeed, they are a mainstay of Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox art down to this day. But there were some caveats made. For one thing, everyone in the East agreed that statues were right out, and to this day you do not see statues in Eastern Orthodox art. But this conflict also further cemented the split with the Latin Church in the West. The popes in Rome just could not figure out what this whole debate about icons was over, because remember, icons weren't particularly important in the Western Latin Church. Popes increasingly thought of the Greeks as religiously bizarre, fighting over what to the Latin West seemed to be an inconsequential issue. And indeed, iconoclasm never caught on in the medieval West, at least not until the end of the Middle Ages with the much later Protestant Reformation. But again, that was based on precedents in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. The recovery of the Byzantine position was slow and gradual, and the many specific moments need not distract us here. Suffice it to say that the worst of the Byzantine Dark Age, as it has sometimes been called, that is, this low point when the Byzantine Empire was nearly destroyed by the various conquests of the 600s, really only came to an end by the time of the iconoclastic controversy had come to an end, around the time period of, say, the 820s to 840s. Now, the empire by this point had been vastly reduced in size, but its borders had stabilized, and its biggest internal crisis, iconoclasm, had been solved. But in the process, the Eastern Roman Empire, this Byzantine Empire, had been profoundly changed. By this point, Greek was officially the language of the empire. The cultural distinctions between the Latin and Greek churches had crystallized and become clear by the 800s. The Byzantines were, at this point, fully and obviously culturally distinct from the heirs of Rome in the West, those various barbarian kingdoms we've looked at, even if it would be difficult to say at exactly what point this tipping point had been reached. On the other hand, the economic transformations of the Byzantine Empire were just as dramatic. The loss of so much territory, combined with the devastating wars against both external and internal foes, had led to the decline of traditional cities, with the sole exception of Constantinople itself. With the loss of the other major metropolises of the East, the patriarchates of Antioch and Alexandria, that is, to the Arab Muslims, and the decline of other major cities in what remained of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople increasingly became the focus and heart of this Eastern Empire. In fact, it often was referred to as the Queen of Cities, a massive metropolis housing hundreds of thousands of people with no rival left in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine military was also reorganized into an almost entirely defensive force. It was no longer the long-range military able to conquer under Justinian and Heraclius, but instead was composed of numerous fortresses deep into Byzantine territory, ready to meet the raids of Arabs or Slavs, what modern military tacticians refer to as defense in depth. Increasingly, the military came to overshadow the civilian administration, but unlike in the West, the Eastern emperors never lost control of their armies, or if they did, it was in a coup as in the old days of the Roman Empire, not with barbarians carving out separate kingdoms. But archaeological and coin evidence also shows a gradual economic recovery centered around Constantinople itself as the focus of markets, but stretching across the remaining Byzantine territories and well beyond them, as I demonstrate in this map on this slide, which shows the trade routes of this portion of the world at the time, many of them centered on Constantinople. That's because as long-distance trade revived, as wars died down in the 7 and into the 800s, Constantinople's key strategic location uniting Europe and Asia, as well as the Black Sea with the Mediterranean, made it a natural center of trade routes across Eurasia and a key link between Western Europe and the rest of the world. And speaking of which, by this point, Constantinople was by far the largest city in Europe. Now, interestingly, one example of this long-distance trade happening in exactly this time period was that some Byzantine monks had managed to successfully smuggle silkworms out of China, along with the mulberries that they needed to plant mulberry trees, which is the main diet of silkworms. And that actually allowed the Byzantines to set up their own local silk production industry in southern Greece. And that made the Byzantine Empire of the Central Middle Ages one of the major suppliers of this luxury fabric silk for the next several centuries, from say, the 800s until the 1000s. If you find any silk in Western Europe in this time period, from say the 800s to the 1000s, like I said, most often this silk will have originated in the Byzantine Empire, which provided them with a new market, a new industry that in part allowed the Byzantine economy to recover, along with several others. Now, certainly, this was not the same empire as it had been under Justinian. No one could now even entertain the idea of reuniting the Roman world with so much territory lost in both the West and now the East. But the Byzantines had ridden out the storm, and they had forged an impressive empire nonetheless, one that survived for another half a millennium as a major player in Mediterranean politics, and equally deserves the title of heir of Rome.